Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasulihil Kareem, amma ba'd, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a brief introduction to a very famous scholar, mutakallim, a theologian by the name Abū Manṣūr al-Maturidi. He died in 333 Hijri or 944. His book here that I just want to look at very briefly is called Kitāb al-Tawḥīd. And I want to look at what's called epistemology. Epistemology is basically how we know truth, right? How we know something to be true. Or how do we receive knowledge? How do we know something's true? How do we know that what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're observing, what we're thinking about is a reflection of reality? Before I do that, I just want to quickly touch upon something, because a lot of people raise this question, and sometimes it can be a legitimate question, that we have the Quran for Muslims, and we have the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And so everything is in the Quran and the Sunnah, which is true. So why do we need scholars? Why do we need schools of law? Why do we need schools of theology? Why do we need schools of Sufism to tell us how to practice things? And the reason for that is very, very simple. We need to basically, in this particular case, we need to know what truth is. And we also need to know our aqidah, our creed. Now, if that was left to me and you, we would go to the Quran and Sunnah and we would pick out verses and we would pick out hadith that we think would make sense and allow us to make our own theology. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the early Muslims didn't need all of this, because they met the Prophet, peace be upon him. They were with him, they knew what he was saying, they saw what he was doing, and so forth. But as time went by, as a Muslim empire began to grow, they met with Christians, they met with Jews, they met with people of other faiths, people started asking them questions. So Muslims had to create a framework, a robust framework, which would allow them to take the Quran and the Sunnah and allow them to reach here. And that process over 14 centuries, over 14 centuries of scholarship allowed them to create a beautiful, logical, reasonable system, which is all based on Quran and Sunnah. They take all the verses of the Quran, they take every ayat, they take every Sunnah, every hadith of Prophet, and they make sense of it, and they give you a book, right? That's my book, which basically gives you your aqidah. They've looked at every verse. So even if there's a verse, for example, that might appear to contradict another verse, they'll make sense of it. They say, oh, there's no contradiction here. Or they might get a hadith, or they might have a group of hadiths which say one thing and another group of hadiths which say something else. They'll make sense of that. They say, oh, there's no contradiction here. If you think about it, this is what the Prophet meant. So through all of that, what you have is a ready-made system that gives you aqidah. And so we're very blessed as Muslims to have this system. It's worth bearing this in mind. Okay, so that was just a brief introduction to that. Let me talk about his epistemology. So let me talk about his epistemology, and I'll go through it with you, inshallah. So there's two types of epistemology that Imam Maturidi has. And remember, this is to do with sources of knowledge. So he has three, which he talks about. And this is to do with general knowledge. So general knowledge. General knowledge. Number one, Imam Maturidi mentions, is sense perception. Right? You know things through your senses, through smelling, through tasting, through seeing, through hearing, and so forth. And this is called Iyan. It's also called Hawas. Okay, senses. His, from the senses. The second type is what's called testimony or reports. Okay, testimony or reports. And that's usually called Sam or Akhbar. All right. And the third one is called reason. right? You reason things out. And that's usually called aql or nazar. Now, there are more intricacies, but I'm not going to go into all of that. So these are 3 ways that you would get general knowledge as well. But at the same time, let me just change the color of my pen. At the same time, religious knowledge has its own sources as well. Religious knowledge. So it has its own epistemology, and there's a difference between them. So religious knowledge for Imam Maturidi is 2, right? This one here, testimony and report. Testimony and reports. The second one is reason. Now you'll notice he excludes sense perception as a form of knowledge when it comes to your religion. When it comes to general knowledge, you can have sense perception, but when it comes to religious knowledge, religious truth, Imam Maturidi doesn't include it. Now, one of the reasons he does that is very simple. When you have a prophet, one of his proofs for his prophethood, right? Proof of prophethood is miracles. Now, miracles requires sense perception. You need to see it. But only the early Muslim community, the people who were around the Prophet, witnessed the miracles. For example, the splitting of the moon, only they observed that. So you can't use that for people like us today in the 21st century. But you can use the first two. You can use testimony and reason, but not sense perception when it comes to religious knowledge as well. The second thing that's worth bearing in mind as well, that there's certain types of knowledge which are necessary. It's just like it's obvious. It doesn't require thinking, right? Necessary knowledge. Let me actually go back and do that in a different color so it just stands out a bit more. Let's pick this color. So you have necessary knowledge, right? You have necessary knowledge. And this is called ilm daruri. In Arabic, we call it ilm daruri. So some things are so obvious, it's just everybody knows about it. Right? It has to be, a necessary knowledge has to be irrefutable, and it has to be beyond doubt. Okay? Like, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. That's necessary knowledge, ilm daruri, right? And the only one that's like that is sense perception. The only one that like that is sense perception. And one of the reasons they exclude that from religious knowledge is that to have necessary knowledge, which comes from sense perception, it would have to be, for example, therefore you can't argue that straight away that knowledge of God, because knowledge of God is not known by the senses. It's not ilm daruri. It requires reflection to come to know knowledge of God, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. So this is some of the reasons why Imam Maturidi says that when it comes to religious knowledge, when it comes to this type of knowledge, there's only 2 types. When it comes to general knowledge, there are indeed 3 types. That's just a brief introduction. I want to take you through these very, very quickly. It's just so you get some insight. This is not an exhaustive treatment, by the way, but just to give you an introduction to this. So let's look at the first type, which is religious knowledge. Okay, remember there's 2 types of religious knowledge. Remember, there's only 2 types. There's no sense perception. So religious knowledge is the first one that I want to cover. One of the things that's very, very interesting is that we all, when it comes to knowledge, we all rely on authority, right? We all follow our authority of predecessors, right? So we all follow people that have come before us. Oh, what's happened here? Okay. We all follow the authority of our predecessors. Let me try and keep the pen consistent. Okay. So we all follow the authority of predecessors. Like everybody does this. Everybody you know will follow an authority. So even if he's a Muslim, he'll follow the ulama, he'll follow scholars, he'll follow the Prophet, peace be upon him. Even if he's an atheist, so even if you have a person that's an atheist, right? Where does he get the ideas from? Well, he gets it from people who are atheists themselves. Atheists themselves, right? So they've written books. And so they follow the authority. So everybody has what I would call an isnad. Everybody has a sanad. Everybody has a chain of transmission. Everybody follows authority. Even people who say that I don't believe in God, they still get the idea from somewhere, right? So that's something to bear in mind. So they would argue that, so the atheists would say, well, we believe in our predecessors and other atheists who wrote books before us. Muslims will say, well, we believe in the Prophet. So everybody follows some form of authority, right? And then the real thing is that you have to use reason to argue who to follow. Argue who to follow. Everybody will claim that they're on the truth. You hear this often. So this is something to bear in mind. So let's go back to religious knowledge now. So in terms of religious knowledge, there's two types, right? Number one, number two. Number one is testimony. Testimony. And the second is reason. Remember, we haven't included sense perception for the reasons that I've outlined before as well. Okay? And so people need testimony, what's called sam, or they need aql. That's how we come to religious knowledge, right? So that's something to bear in mind. So as for testimony as a source of knowledge, you need people to tell you things, right? Even today, like when it comes to news, we take it from people who have told us the news. When it comes to the media, everybody takes knowledge from this. So Muslims, we have a source of knowledge, which is the testimony of people before us, right? So the companions who saw the Prophet, and then that's passed on to us. So we have, for example, we have the companions, right? Who then pass it on to the next generation. And that knowledge reaches us, right? Eventually it reaches me and you in 2022. Okay, this is something to bear in mind. The second way, let's put numbers there. The second way we come to know is through reason. Okay, and one of the ways we can know this, there are many ways that people talk about this, is that if we think about wisdom, what's called hikmah. What's called wisdom. That this world hasn't been created for no reason, right? And it makes sense to us when we think about it, when we really use our brain, that we don't do something without wisdom. We don't create this world just for the fun of it, right? And this world has a purpose. And we can make sense of that, right? It has a purpose. It's not been created to perish, right? And God would not have created the world for no reason, right? And intelligent people use wisdom. They reason things out, right? And nothing is ever done in vain, right? So we know the world is created. For a purpose. And that's a wise purpose, right? That's a wise purpose. Okay. Now, having mentioned that much, we also know that human beings have different desires, different inclinations, different motives, different ways of doing things. And if we left everybody to do their own thing, there would be conflict. So we need a way to resolve the conflict, right? Some people might say, well, like today, some people might say, well, we believe that there is no such thing as biological gender. Or somebody might say, we think the world should be ruled by democracy. Some people might say, well, we need kings and queens. So we need a way to resolve that. We also need to know what's right and wrong as well, right? And so there must be principles that at least reduce or eliminate conflict. And that's what religion does. So Islam comes, and Islam gives us an entire worldview of how to live, right? Otherwise, we're going to have destruction. We don't want that. Islam is not about that. Islam is about peace, it's about stability, it's about human flourishing. All right? So that's religious knowledge done. I want to briefly quickly touch upon the second source of knowledge, which I made the first one in my schema, which was the general knowledge, or scientific knowledge if you want. All right? And we said that there are three types. Okay? So this is something to bear in mind. One of them was, just to remind ourselves, one was sense perception, which isn't included in religious. Number two was reports. I'm not going to use the Arabic now, just to save time. And number three was reasoning. Right? So when it comes to general knowledge, when it comes to making our general knowledge, we have these three. Right? We use this in science, sense perception, we observe things and so forth and so on. This is in general knowledge. Okay. Now this one here, let me just get, this one here is to do with the senses, or what's called the hawas. Okay. And it's like, this is so obvious, like you just see it, you know that it exists. Right? So that's very, very important, straightforward. The second one is called reports. And these are things that reach us, right, from other people. And we can't do without that. We need people to tell us about things. So whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Christian, whether you're some other person of faith, whether you're an atheist, right? You get all of these ideas from other people that have come before you. Nobody appears like with ideas in a vacuum, right? That's very, very important, because a lot of people think atheist is someone that's really, really smart, intelligent, and he's thought about that there's no God that exists through his own reason. No, he's got it from somebody else. We've got it from our Prophet. So we've all got people that we follow. The final one is nazar, which is called reasoning. And what we do with reasoning is very, very interesting. What we basically do is we use both of these to come to reasoning. So we use our sense perception and we use what's come to us to reason things out. Okay, there are different ways that you can use reasoning. Okay, because there are certain things that are simply out of reach. We just can't know through our senses. So we have to use reasoning. Okay? And the same applies with this as well. There are certain things that we don't know ourselves, but we know someone's reliable. We've looked at the evidence and we trust them that they've told us the truth. Right? That have they told us the truth? And so through reasoning, we also make sense of it as well. Right? So reasoning is something that brings this one and this one together to make sense of knowledge. And we do it all together all the time. We hear something and we use our ears that we've heard something, and we know straight away through our reasoning that there must be someone there, something there. We haven't observed it through our sense perception, but we've used our senses, our ears, and we use reasoning to tell us that someone is there. Okay, and the same thing goes for reports as well. Okay, we use this to differentiate between someone who is a sorcerer or a person who's engaging in deception and someone who's genuinely authentic. Okay, because we think about, well, you know, this person is a liar. He could, no matter how many magic tricks that he does, we can't trust him because he's lying. He's a fabricator. But this other person that we've got, it's reached us that he's never lied. He was honest. He was sincere. He was truthful, And it makes sense that we would trust someone like that. And it's very similar, we do that with media as well, right? Many of us are very skeptical about the media because over time we realize and we know that they lie to us on a regular basis. They distort the truth. So anyway, these are ways of knowing. These are the two theories of knowledge by Imam Maturidi. I hope you found that useful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.